So this is why different, cryptocurrency centralized exchanges have things like what we call, cold wallets, and they might have this whole security team they're dedicated to figuring out how these things work. And this means they have these actual servers where they're storing the private keys and they're offline in air-gapped computers, meaning there's no connection to the internet. And then if they need to transfer funds, they can go over there, they can sign a transaction, then bring it back, to the internet world where things are connected and networked, and then they can send out the transaction. But not everyone is a centralized cryptocurrency exchange with an entire security team. And so people can instead rely on what are called hardware wallets. So the most common sort of variant that people are used to is called Ledger. And this is the one that Pontem just announced integration for in its wallet. So a Ledger wallet is kind of like, it's a cold wallet, right? It's a hardware wallet. It means it's a physical piece of hardware that has the private key inside of it, and that you can't sign a transaction unless you actually have physical access to this instrument. So the hardware wallet can't connect to the internet. It can normally just connect to your computer over USB, over Bluetooth. But the thing is that when you are interfacing with it, you don't actually get the private key. You send it over data like a blob, a binary large object, and then the actual instrument signs that in its inside of the hardware wallet and then sends back the signed transaction so it can be verified that it was signed. But you can never actually get the private key off of it. And so it ends up being a really secure instrument for protecting against attacks. So even if you forget the password on your computer and you're really lazy and you use the same password for everything, if you use a hardware wallet, even if someone hacks your laptop, they can't actually get your funds unless they have physical access to the hardware wallet, and then potentially can compromise you using what's known as a $5 wrench attack, where they just threaten you with a cheap wrench to activate your hardware wallet. But these things are really secure, and I think that there have been these like white hack DevOps teams that haven't been able to hack them. I know that Kraken, I think, once was able to do something if they had like physical access to it and all this different lab equipment. But then it was immediately patched right afterwards. And I don't even remember who the manufacturer was of that hardware wallet. But the main thing is that this allows, especially developers, right, to ensure that they essentially can't be hacked from some malicious actor on the internet, which happens all the time when people, I don't even know, like VPN into your machine or do some weird desktop sharing thing, and then all of a sudden they have access to your data. So they can like steal your cat pictures or whatever that you store locally, but they can't get your funds. And on top of this, another interesting avenue for the hardware wallets is that you can use these also in a multi-sig. So the hardware wallet just stores a private key, but you can have multiple people with hardware wallets with their own individual private keys that are individually secured inside of these actual different pieces of hardware. And then those people can collectively sign one single transaction that authorizes operations on the blockchain. So this is what Econia is planning to do for its contract deployment, and this is what a lot of different protocols have settled on as well. And on that note, with the whole like multi-sig, this is something that one of the partners in the ecosystem, MentoSafe, has been adding support for. So you can think of this as kind of like fault tolerance. So in the beginning, I talked about, how can you get your key compromised if you have it on a hot wallet versus a hardware wallet? One way is just your computer gets hacked, or you're sloppy with your passwords or whatever, right? And you're storing your private key, in a way that's connected to the internet. So you can put in a hardware wallet and you can make sure that can't, get like digitally compromised, right? But then if you want to make sure that something can't get physically compromised, you can do the multi-sig. And you have this interesting kind of optimization scenario where, say you look at any like arbitrary address on chain, and you're thinking, okay, so what has to happen for this thing to send a malicious transaction, right? There's rug pulls is the first one, right? You need to make sure that the project is trusted, right? You need to make sure the code's doing what you think it's doing. And so like being open source and audited are a big part of that. But then also, what about just breaches, right? So if you have a multi-sig, in theory, you can have a multi-sig with 32 addresses, and the people could be really sloppy with their wallets. Everyone could be using a hot wallet. They could be storing their keys in a Google Sheet, like we heard, came out of FTX, for example. And then you could like even 5 of those people could be compromised, and their private keys could be stolen, and their funds could be stolen, right? They could be personally compromised, but the multi-sig wallet would still be valid because you wouldn't have anybody else compromised. So there are all these different fault tolerance, methods in securing a smart contract. And for developers, one of the most secure ways, obviously, is to have a multi-sig where every signatory on that has a hardware wallet. And this has been a feature that we've been really anxious for, because we, on testnet, for example, it's easy to do it on a hot wallet. You just publish it on the contract and someone says, hey, can you tune this on chain variable? Yeah, sure. Let me go to the command line. But that's all where the funny money is. So having that ease of use is, kind of worth it, because it doesn't matter if you get hacked on testnet, right? And in one sense, the security is always kind of going to be kind of like a trade-off for convenience. People don't like to enter their passwords at every step of the way for things, and they don't like to put their fingerprints on everything and get fingerprinted all the time. But these really are the ways that we prevent the kinds of adversarial behaviors that can prevent compromises on a smart contract or whatever. And so the Pontem's recent integration with Ledger helps with this, and so does the multi-sig spec that Aptos enables. And one thing that's interesting to note too is that this whole like hardware wallet a lot of times supports multiple wallets and what's called hierarchical deterministic wallets. So this was actually proposed originally as a Bitcoin improvement proposal. I believe the number was BIP44, hierarchical deterministic wallets. And so the idea here is that you can have one master key, and that's generated typically by a seed phrase. So you remember a bunch of words like boat, fork, bridge, whatever, and then those get actually converted into, I believe it is 128-bit integer. So a sequence of 128 zeros and ones. And then down the line, you can use that so-called entropy to generate wallet upon wallet upon wallet, and they're all secured by the same seed phrase. So it really is, the $1 million password, and it doesn't just have to correspond to one individual account. You can secure multiple ones. You can even secure multiple ones across different blockchains. So this is one of the luxuries of Ledger. This is where I kind of want to make sure that I want to put a disclaimer. Like, I'm not trying to shill Ledger or anything. I know that other hardware wallets use similar things. I just haven't used them as much. But the idea is that you have one master seed phrase, and from this are derived the private keys for all of your wallets, and on different blockchains. And so you have, for example, like you can have one master seed phrase. You can control all your wallets on Bitcoin, one on Ethereum, and then one on like Solana, say, and on Aptos too. The interesting thing about Aptos is that their account system uses this key rotation. So traditionally on other blockchains, you have public key and private key. And your private key is, the hex sequence, 0xA3BFD or whatever. And that corresponds to a public key. So you sign with your private key, and people see with your public key that that transaction has been verified. And usually on other blockchains, your account, like how people you refer to you on the blockchain, is the same as your public key. So you're like, I want to send it to this public key, and then you know that the person on the other side is a private key. Aptos actually has this middle layer of abstraction, and the account address is different from the public key. And this is where things can get kind of tricky, is because originally when you publish like the first time on a chain, your public key is equivalent to your account address. But let's say, for example, you wrote down the password on a piece of paper and someone else found that piece of paper. You wrote down your private key and you're like, okay, so now my private key is compromised. But maybe they haven't done anything yet. You can do what's called key rotation. So you send a special transaction that changes the private key and therefore the public key that maps to your account address. So say you got some address on chain and you're having everyone send it to you. It's like ABC123, and the private key for that gets compromised. You can still have ABC123, but you can actually have a different private key. So it's kind of like having a Gmail address that you reset the password to. Now, there's an important distinction here, is we don't want people to think that you can just go online and you can change the password willy-nilly, because you can only do it in circumstances, right? You can't recover the private key per se, but you can change it. And this is where the rotation comes in. So it protects against certain kinds of compromises, right? So if someone else finds your private key, right? But if you lose your private key, then you're still kind of screwed. So this is where things like hardware wallets and multiple redundant backups come into play. And those are some of the obviously useful things that we see with the multi-sig and with hardware wallets. So say someone loses their private key, right? Then you can rotate them out of the multi-sig wallet for the smart contract address, for example, which is helpful. And another cool thing about this is that it allows people to use vanity addresses in a way that are actually secured on chain. So let's say on another chain, right, you went in Python or wherever and you generated some kind of address that begins with something funny, right? So Solana has base 58 addresses, which means you can use all letters of the alphabet except for like uppercase I, lowercase I. So it's a little easier to give an example there, but you could make your address, if you really wanted to, be like your name, or you could have it be something silly like poopy or whatever. And so you generate this base 58 address. You just generate private key upon private key upon private key until it begins with this. It's kind of like mining. You're mining addresses. But then the problem is you've generated that private key in often a hot machine, right? That's not air gapped. And so then you kind of are like, well, I have this address I like the name of, but it's not the most secure. So on Aptos, by contrast, you can actually generate that vanity address, and then you could just rotate the key to something more legit, and then you actually have a vanity address that is secured because you basically threw away the password that was not secured with the hot wallet. So this is one of the advantages of, you could do like the most secure thing, and I think the coolest thing for contract deployers would be if you somehow can figure out some kind of leet speak or hex speak like code that corresponds to your protocol. So for us in our docs, you might see we use codebook, right? You can do that in hex C0DEB00C. You could generate a vanity address that starts with those things, and the original private key, public key pair for that would be, invalid, right? You'd want to throw that out because you generated it in an insecure way. But you can generate it and then immediately rotate it to something else. And as long as it's been rotated, it doesn't matter if someone else actually got the private key, because now they don't know the new private key, and that's what you could secure with the hardware wallet and the multi-sig spec. So a lot of cool opportunities there. I'm going to stop my diatribe and check in maybe with Sadoji and see where we're at in this space.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for putting that together. I really take it for granted, all the information that we've accumulated over this period of time, and how difficult it must be for someone coming in new into the space to understand how all of this works. A lot of people are very technical, I would assume, and even just applying new taxonomy to crypto. Like, for example, the hardware wallet, the HD wallets that you were mentioning, how this applies and how they can, for example, have one ledger device for Ethereum, Bitcoin, Aptos. So all of this is, I think, also important for people to understand the detailed stuff. So I really appreciate that, and definitely, we'd love to have you come on more often, and honestly, like, do more of these. I think these are important. I think people really appreciate them, and yeah, thank you for giving a shout out to Ledger. Yeah, it took a really long time, but this is a key primitive that needs to happen so that we can be safer as an ecosystem. Upgrade authority on contracts is something that's relatively fairly common on chains like Solana, for example. And I'm sure Aptos as well, as that's an option when you're deploying contracts. And something like Ledger and multi-sig is definitely super, super important to have as a key primitive to make sure that the apps that are coming are safer. Actually, Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, totally. And I think the cool part about Ledger is that it's this almost like meta level thing across all the blockchains that, like you said, you can use one passphrase to secure all of them. And I think that the hierarchical deterministic part is actually really important too, because you can have multiple wallets per chain. So you have the BIP44 standard. So you have like 44/501. I think that's the Solana one, and slash something else. I forgot what Aptos' chain ID is, but you have like 44 standard chain ID, and then you have one little division and then another division. So you have all these little folders of wallets, and you don't have to generate a new private key, because that just becomes, you have to have like a database of private keys at that point in order to secure everything. And so it makes it way easier to just do it with one passphrase. And one thing I'm wondering too about the Ledger integration, you might have more visibility on this, is where we are, if anywhere, with integration with that in the Aptos CLI, because I know a lot of builders use the Aptos CLI for compiling code and for doing on-chain kind of operations that might be a lot faster with automation that you might not want to do in a wallet.
Yeah, definitely. We have it on the developer build. So if you're just using it straight from GitHub, it was working. I'll double check if this new app that we built can also be compatible with the CLI. Then we might need to do updates to the CLI itself. So, but yeah, that's definitely going to be huge. And yeah, this is first step in bringing this infrastructure. Also want to welcome the folks from Everstake as well. If you want to do a quick intro as well for our audience, we had a great, definitely great space this week actually. So yeah.
Hi everyone. Sure. My name is Alexi. I'm from Everstake. I'm not sure what are your guys' names. So can you tell me what are your names?
Yeah. So I go by Sadoji. Econia.
Oh.
Yeah, Al Noki here, core developer at Econia. Also, I think I remember you. Were you on the Tsunami Twitter space earlier this week? Because I think we were both on there.
Yeah, that's actually where we met first time. So that's Sadoji, the same Sadoji, the profile that I have. And Econia, what's your name again?
I go by Al Noki. So if you look through the GitHub, I'm like the main commit author on there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just wanted to say hi. I read about this tweet from Aptos, from you guys, that Aptos retweeted that you are now basically have a connection to Ledger. I'm not that like a big on an expert on wallets and Ledger. Just wanted to say hi. And I don't know if you discussed this earlier. What are your next plans? I mean, Ledger, that's a giant step in terms of mass adoption and security, especially. But what are your next steps?
In terms of the wallet, this is definitely a huge milestone. What we're looking at next, and this is going to require work with the Aptos team as well, and I think they're definitely receptive to it. It's doing smart contract wallets, of having that be standard that we can also use on Aptos. It'll enable a lot of use cases, like for example, delegating gas costs to another address. It can also enable social recovery. So with a set of guardians, or you could essentially create a multi-sig that allows you to sign transactions with yourself and a set of guardians.
That sounds really cool. Actually, never heard about it. I don't know if that's your first one to like implement this technology, but that sounds exciting.
Yeah, the most common one that's being widely adopted is called Argent. Argent Wallet is a well-known smart contract wallet. I believe it's on one of the layer twos, maybe one of the ZK layer twos. But I believe it requires, and maybe Alnoki would know this better, but I believe it would require some form of change to the core, to the Aptos core to implement. I'm not sure how familiar it would be, but it's not something that's super common, but it's something that definitely people have been advocating for moving in this direction, including even Vitalik. But yeah, Alnoki, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the smart contract wallets like Argent.
So we had actually looked into a similar kind of like deployment schema on chain. It ends up being a lot simpler if you do the multi-sig just off chain. So I can maybe give a little more context on this. So the way that Aptos's ED 25519 signer schema is implemented, you can basically like come to the blockchain with a transaction payload that's already signed, and then the blockchain will like execute it if it's a valid signature. So this is really easy for doing off-chain signing if it's a single signer, because you just have your private key and you like sign it in Python or on your hardware wallet or whatever, and then it executes. But with a multi-sig schema, you actually have to have people like sign it off-chain and then kind of send around this like blob basically, and then the final person to sign it submits that as this payload. So it can be kind of clunky. If you do it completely on chain, you basically have to do a custom solution as far as I'm aware right now. And this is something we actually looked into. If you guys look through our GitHub issues, we've got a lot of like sample code, and we're like thinking out loud about this with Jackie from Momentum Safe. But the idea is that you kind of define like a governance module. And so once you do it on chain, you essentially have all these different like questions you have to ask. Like, okay, how many people do I want in there? How many people do I want in order to kick people out? Do I want to emit an event every time someone signs it? So you can really get as creative as you want. And actually the kind of closest instantiation of this that I would say already is out there is actually the Aptos governance framework. So it has this governance proposal format where you submit a script to the blockchain, and a script is basically a computer file that has all of the different things in a transaction in it. It's like a really complex transaction. So you can essentially submit a transaction for approval, and then once everyone in the quote unquote wallet, the governance forum it's called, approves it, then that transaction executes. And so in this way, you can actually have a record of all the transaction hashes on chain, and then you can even see who voted, and there's an on-chain record of it, which I think there is definitely a kind of like market opportunity for someone here to build something like this. Aptos's governance framework is tailor-made for Aptos, and it I think involves also doing things with like the Aptos stake. But you can do some kind of bespoke things that give you the same functionality, and I'd honestly love to see this from the community, especially with audited open source contracts, because it gives people the ability to, say you're in a multi-sig group that controls a contract, rather than going on Telegram or wherever and being like, hey, yo, signatory 2, I just signed this. Let me drop this attachment as a blob in here. You sign it and then send it to signatory 3 and make sure, they sign it using their little like Python or shell script or whatever, and then send the blob back in here. And you have this like attachment that keeps growing with signatures going around in Telegram, and it's like, who is signed it? Does it get out of order? Instead, you just have, you just go in Telegram or Discord or wherever, and you're like, hey, everybody, I just submitted this proposal. Everyone sign it. and then people will go on chain and it'll automatically execute once the last person does it. And a really cool thing about this too is that you can submit the script that you want to execute. You can like publish it in a public place. So GitHub, right, for example. So you make a transaction script. The code is open source for what function calls you want to make in there. It can be as simple as transferring funds, right? It can be more complex, like modifying on-chain variables for a protocol. And you take the hash of that script, and anyone can verify that hash publicly. So they can be like, all right, it's on GitHub. I know exactly what the code is doing. It's open source. It's, I can see it for myself. I can audit it myself. Then you take the hash of that and you look on chain. You're like, well, is the script that they submitted for proposal the same hash? And then you can say, okay, it is. Yeah, this is actually the script they submitted. And then you vote on it. So it makes it a lot more transparent, and it's easier to coordinate in ways, especially once you get to more signatories. Like the Aptos multi-sig spec allows up to 32 signatories, and that would be off-chain signing, which already is like somewhat impractical. But if you do on-chain, you could do infinite. Like you can use a Aptos framework table, which supports 2 to the power of 64 different potential signatories in it if you want to track people who are in there. So there are all kinds of options you have to do it on chain. And it ultimately does become more of a like project bespoke implementation that I would definitely love to see from other people in the community. So if you're listening and you are a developer and you have more bandwidth than Econia does right now, go build that and we'll use it.
I have a question for more on a normie side, because I consider myself normie in terms of like I don't code and all. But so basically, in a nutshell, you're adding a social element to a transaction in order to secure it and make it more public, right?
That's right. Yeah. If you want to do it on chain, it becomes more social in like that way. Like you said, you can think of it almost like a congressional bill or something, right? Like the bill is public. It's maintained in the library of the Senate or whatever. And then all the votes are kept public and people can see how they voted. With off-chain signing, I think that there are like proofs you can do that Momentum Safe is implemented, and then those get published on chain. But yeah, it's not as much of a social engagement. And I think ultimately, even though it might appear more of like a senatorial or whatever kind of decision, it can be really fast, right? You have everyone set up automatic notifications on their phone or their email or whatever. That's like, as soon as a proposal comes in, email me, and then they just go check the Discord, and the person's like, hey, here's the GitHub link to the latest proposal, go vote. And so everyone can do it at that moment. So I think it actually makes it a little more efficient.
Yeah, I have a question. Actually, someone on the nickname of Tycho Crypto Firm, they said that bullish on multi-signature for institutional investors. Do you see that's something that institutional investors might use in future? Well, that's actually a question for both.
Yeah, I think that it honestly depends on the institution. So like if you are JP Morgan Chase, right, and you want to invest in crypto asset X, there's actually a decent like operational question of how you do that, right? Like which division of the company is doing it, where, like who kind of owns that project, quote unquote. And then even within there, like you have to have some pretty decent corporate controls to make sure that you have that, because often there'll just be like one guy whose job is to like sign all the signatures on different things, and he keeps the passwords on his computer somewhere, right? And if he gets fired or he leaves, there's a really high bust factor. But honestly, sometimes
that's not something that we want.
I know.
Blockchain.
I'm just trying to lay out like how it sometimes happens at different places, and like definitely encourage that they do this. And I think that like doing it on chain might be a good way. Like they could, if someone had this wallet, like Alejo mentioned, it's on chain, institutions could then say something like, okay, we require that if you're on chain, you have to do this on chain wallet, and we have to have multiple people. But it really, it's interesting because you basically have the company as the sole authority, but then you have multiple signatories within that company. So it's like you're fracturing authority within a central authority. And it's often like unusual, I guess, to do that in some cases. It's kind of like checks and balances within a government. But I think institutional investors like would be more secured if they did it. Often they have some kind of team that really just manages all the like maybe the private keys in one place, and so they can be more rest assured. But yeah, I mean, it really is. We want to see it, but I don't know exactly how they'll do it because they want to be efficient as well.
I have a question. Sorry for taking the mic. Unless you want to say something, Satoshi, I have another question for you.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to chime in there. I think Alnoki's definitely right in the sense that it should be best practice for these institutions to use multi-sig. I would say there's a spectrum of what institutional even means, and there's a lot of crypto native firms, but there's also, as we know, more traditional firms like market makers, for example, Jump entering the space. And I would imagine as we go into even more conservative firms like a JP Morgan, they might even already be doing it. They should have really good processes internally. There are service providers like Fireblocks, Coinbase custody, Gemini custody, Credo, BitGo, etc., that do provide custody services. Although to the best of my knowledge, after talking to a few of these, not many are embedding themselves into DeFi. And something as new as Aptos, for example, would probably not have integrations directly with a lot of these. So they're probably still handling like some form of hot wallet. And then that hot wallet, I would hope that they also have some form of process in place using a multi-sig and ledger device of a few people that are authorized to make transactions. But I think in the future, we'll probably see more of these custody solutions being implemented, and then wallets being front end for connecting into either fully custodial, so you're giving your entire set of keys to a custodian, or maybe semi-custodial, you hold through a multi-sig, one event, and then with something like social recovery or social multi-sig, you can then execute transactions. I think that's probably where we're at, but we definitely need more standards and how these are used by institutions so they feel safer.
And also with the DeFi, like Alejo was mentioning, the doing things like multi-sig becomes like an operational problem, because again, the price of security is inconvenience. So you can do it for things like, say, Wintermute has a giant treasury where they're like deploying, like funds from. That could be multi-sig, right? Where if you want to move out of the like $500 million pot into one of these sub accounts, then you need a multi-sig, right? But if you want to trade on one of these sub accounts, I think the best you could do is you basically have, because you have to like place multiple transactions sometimes in a second. You're essentially doing high frequency trading on chain. So you can't wait for consensus for like the other guy down the hall to finish his coffee break and sign the transaction, because that's what your corporate controls say. So you kind of have to do some kind of automated signing, whether it's some kind of like Python or C++ implementation of an HFT strategy. But there are things you can do still to make it more secure, to make sure that those wallets don't get compromised. So one thing is like you have the kind of like the HFT like module on one computer that's connected to the internet, and then say you have a hardware like you have like a separate computer that actually has the key on it, and that is connected only to the like HFT computer with like an Ethernet cable. And so you can only get a transaction by submitting it to the like Ethernet cable gapped computer that isn't connected to the internet directly, but it's connected to the computer that's connected to the internet. And it's kind of like a hardware wallet that approves every transaction in a sense. So you can't steal the private key, but you could maybe spoof it by hacking into the intermediary computer. But again, you have to be able to send transactions like
don't give them ideas.
Yeah, it makes it really tough for running HFT strategies, at least. If you only want to trade like once a day or once every couple of weeks, say you're like a longer term investor, like a big high grade institution like JP Morgan Chase, you're not going to be trading things every second, unless maybe you have some kind of commodities division. I don't know, but in like a bigger transactions, you can do a multi-sig, but there does become a level where you have to get a little more creative because the trade requires you to do things on a high frequency.
Yeah, maybe putting it on a contract that puts a limit on how much you can do, or puts a limit on it being withdrawn, so that even if that single key is compromised, it's kind of hard to steal the funds from that. These are all the challenges, I think, which we're still seeing friction in institutional adoption. Just something that you could have easily built software for trading now becomes a really tough security exercise, because if you do anything wrong, the money is essentially gone. There's no, you can't go back to the bank and say, hey, my money was stolen. Please give me back that $1 million that was there. They can't just change the spreadsheet.
Speaking of spreadsheets and operational security, One of the things that I think blew my mind most out of the recent FTX debacle was hearing that they had the private keys in a Google sheet, and I think that was what ended up leading to the open source fork or the open book fork of the Serum protocol, if I'm not mistaken, was the private keys in a Google sheet.
Yeah, that's something that people should really be aware of, that protocols, unless immutable or are not as decentralized or as safe as you might think. And just like a centralized application, the code can be updated anytime. Similarly here, if you only have a single signer that has upgrade authority on a contract, that's very dangerous, because that single signer can upgrade the contract to withdraw funds from it. And I think this is something that people didn't realize how maybe common and dangerous it could be until things like this happen, where, yeah, essentially you have hundreds of millions of dollars being secured by a key that's on a Google spreadsheet potentially. So, yeah, that's something that people need to realize and really ask their developers and the contracts that they're using, how they're, if they do have upgrade authority, how they're managing that, making sure that's at the very least on a multi-sig. I was definitely very surprised by the lack of security protocol there.
I also would add too that the question of immutability also becomes, I think, pressing, especially for very complex projects. So I think that there are a lot of projects that they can make a simpler protocol that only does one or two things, let it run for 6 months. They may be trying to do some white hat bounties, and then they publish a transaction that essentially freezes it, because at that point, you probably don't have a vulnerability. But I would also add that I think that white hat bounties are one of the really important dynamics of the space that move it forward, because you can think of it kind of like an immune system. It's this anti-fragile system that only gets better as a whole if it does have some kind of threat model associated with it. Because if everyone was essentially maybe getting just an audit and then they publish it immutably for something really complex, what's to say the auditor didn't miss something, right? You assign a 1% failure probability to an audit, and if you stack up multiple ones, then you might get something. But there's always a possibility that there's something that people didn't exploit, or maybe even somehow some underlying upgrade to the L1 introduces a vulnerability only to your protocol, and so the L1's we're just going to go with it, you guys fix it. So I think that the white hat bounties is a really important part of this. And so it's you all again have a trade-off, because if you have, say, a contract that has the upgrade authority secured by multi-sig, and say it's reputable, say your multi-sig is multiple other protocols who have attested, so they're all kind of trusted together, and you create this conglomerate that itself is not going to collude, well, then you have the consensus problem. It's well, this white hat comes to us and says, hey, I found this glitch, I want to collect the bounty, fix it. And then people are telegramming around this blob and trying to sign it for 3 days, and the person gets antsy and they're well, actually, I'm just going to hack you guys and take 500K, because you wouldn't even pay me 50K in the first place. And 500K isn't enough to trip some kind of alarm at Circle or Coinbase or whatever. So I'm just going to, do it right now. So I think you again even have trade-offs, but I would also add that the upgradability becomes important as a kind of immune system sort of thing that lets people evolve their protocols over time and respond to attacks, especially when they come from people trying to help.
Yeah, definitely. And the migration, if you're doing an immutable protocol and there is some form of bug, is definitely a headache for people. I really like the analogy of it being an immune system. Andreas Antonopoulos, if people are familiar, he's been talking about Bitcoin forever. And he essentially talks about Bitcoin as a sewer rat. And he really has beef with permission blockchains. He thinks that, and maybe likely it could happen as we're seeing CBDCs, for example, get adopted, but essentially permission blockchains as being kind of like a bubble boy. If anybody's seen that movie of a boy stuck in a bubble, so his immune system has never been exposed to anything. But Bitcoin is like the sewer rat that just has all these diseases and continues to live on somehow. But it's because if you have trillions, hundreds of billions of dollars stuck, it's a giant honeypot, and if it could have been hacked, it would have already. And if it doesn't, it just gets bigger with the Lindy effect. But potentially, some of these less explored or less attacked systems might have huge vulnerabilities. But yeah, having the upgrade authority is definitely good sometimes.
Oh yeah, and I would also comment that on the topic of like the permission blockchain, that is from an engineering perspective completely pointless. You know, it's just a database. Why, if at that point, right, you might as well just run like Amazon Redshift or something, because like I kept saying, you know, security is like inconvenience is the price of security, and as fast as blockchains are getting right now, like they simply cannot compete with one dude running a server in like some co-location in Seattle next to Amazon. Like you just cannot beat that because it's way more coordinated. And the whole point of blockchains is that you're running things like many times over, right? You have multiple redundant copies. You have the ledger stored in like 100 places. You have all these consensus transactions to verify that things are working. And this is because no one like trusts each other. And this is the security aspect being permissionless, right? If anyone can participate, you need to verify that people are good on their word, and you need to like in a sense distrust them. And it's again, it's like kind of like cellular biology. We have all these like different checks and balances inside our cells that like it's almost like everything comes with a little lock on it. You know, like the insulin can't activate the other thing, and that's like unless you have a certain amount of like pH or whatever. And this is because every in the like little system inside there is essentially acting in its own self-interest, and they can only coordinate if you have like a million different security vulnerabilities that prevent them like one thing from taking over like a cancer cell, right? And that's kind of what would happen in a permission chain if you had it. Is like you wouldn't have all these robust security measures, and then if you know, forbid someone gets in, it's like you're completely screwed. And but also at that point, like why even have the security checks if you're doing it centralized? Just run your own like cluster. And this reminds me of this hilarious like a Reddit post I saw a few months ago where it was like talking about, it was saying like, yo, check out the bunk tokenomics on this new coin I saw. And it was like one validator node, like inflation is like, you know, this amount, and there's one signature authority, and it's like, oh, by the way, it's the United States dollar or something. And so like, yeah, we basically, once we get to fully permission, it just defeats, I think, the game theoretic and also engineering necessities behind a blockchain in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I worked at IBM for a few years, and I would say there are some benefits. I think if you have a group of people that generally trust each other, but not a lot, like for example, a bunch of banks or a bunch of suppliers in a supply chain or distribution network, then I think potentially you could run something without a token. It's just everybody keeps their own version of the ledger, and then you have that ledger sync. And if there's any dispute, you can look at what everyone else's was. So I think there's some value there, but yeah, it's really not going to be as robust as something that's been out in the open permissionless environment. I would also say there's probably some spectrum of what a permission application or blockchain is. Like I would categorize something like USDC, for example, as more permission, but maybe on the application layer, where like they can essentially freeze any assets if they really do wish. It's also a very centralized thing, but it's still running on a permissionless public blockchain. So I think the idea of like permissionless can be scaled from like the infrastructure all the way down, all the way up to the app level. And I want to say hi to Topaz as well. Yeah, if you want to, whenever, I don't think we've had you on here, so we'd love to, get, just introduce for some of the folks that might not be familiar, but obviously if you're an Aptos, you're probably familiar with Topaz.
Hey everyone, it's kind of loud here, so I'll probably just sit and listen, but thanks for having me out.
Welcome to the fireside.
Yeah, Fireside Friday. This was before things blew up, but I think it's probably, I guess, a recursive meme throughout crypto, just cycles.
Wait, why? Is there some news?
Just no, I mean just in general, the last few months definitely feels like the world's been on fire a little bit.
Oh, okay. Did the line go up?
Line went up, my dude. It went up significantly.
That's what I want to hear.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. None of us are in Aptos, so we can definitely talk about the price. But it's kind of interesting that it just is going up and it's decoupling from Bitcoin and other alts. I think it might have been some form of short squeeze, potentially a lot of short interest on Binance, and it's just getting squeezed up. It's gone up a significant amount, over 100%. Pretty crazy.
Doshi, if I ask a question, will you be honest with me?
It depends.
So do you think that increase of the price has something to do that you are implementing Ledger?
Let's go.
Yeah, it's a 1-to-1 correlation.
I'm pretty sure that's how it works. Yeah. Yeah, I guess people are now able to place bigger buys on chain. But yeah, that we should probably just keep making more hardware wallet integrations, I guess. But no, I mean, I think, it's really hard to predict. I don't think any one form of news will ever, unless there's some really big flow of capital into the system. I don't think some form of news is going to drive price like that anymore. Um, I think this was, if I had to guess, I think it was more so Bitcoin going up, and then there being a lot of short interest on Aptos, and that short interest getting squeezed on Binance. If I had to guess, I think this started before we announced it. I think so. It would definitely, probably not.
I would also add, despite building an order book DEX, it escapes me often to explain like why prices do certain things. And I think anyone who saw like GameStop will recognize that there are interesting trends that do not necessarily play into our traditional intuitions about economics. And even so, like Aptos is essentially it's an altcoin, right, at this point. And I mean the cap, depending on how you define it, right, is in hundreds of millions or a billion. I think it depends on just what you think of as like the dilution at the moment, and how you account for undiluted parts. But yeah, I think this could also be like one person, maybe if with a really big bag trying to do things. I don't know if they bought a bunch on the open market or did something. I think Alejo, you showed me this really interesting graph lately. You were looking at BNB chain, and you're like, look at what some of the top volume is, and it was some coin I never heard of. It was basically a meme coin, and you zoomed out, and it was basically a sawtooth chart. It was like pump from 10 up to 90, back down to 10, up to 90, back down to 10 on regular intervals, and it just shows how much control I think people can have over different assets in one certain amount of time. And it kind of makes me like skeptical, just because I want to be able to know that it was not just like one person that did this. And it kind of begs the question of like, how big do you have to be? How distributed does it have to be before it is impossible for like one sole actor to have that kind of effect?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'll counter that the the graph I was showing you was for what was very likely a very clear pump and dump on PancakeSwap and BNB chain, where essentially it was 100K liquidity and it had like 10 million trading volume over 24 hours, and it looked like a very, just like someone set a bot to essentially pump and dump the coin several times over a few days. So I think, there could definitely be large whales just doing big buys, and I think probably a lot of bots also following price movement. So I think like some of it is definitely a decision, but I think a lot of it is algorithmic at this point. And I think that's probably also true of like traditional markets. I would say like one big whale makes a decision, and then a bunch of bots make their own analysis to whether follow on or do the opposite, I guess.
Yeah, I
Oh
mean,
yeah,
you're
the
not
positive
taking into
feedback is
account
huge.
you're not taking into account that there was a full moon, there was a Mercury retrograde, there was a Mars retrograde. All of this is accounted for in the stars if you're paying attention.
Man, I kind of agree on Topaz, because the more I'm not like that big on an expert in the prices and all, but the more I read about it, like yesterday I read an article about the market, why it's up, the big players are buying before Q2 or Q3 or whatever, because of the something with US economy. And the more I read, the more I feel confused. So at this point, I'll just stick to Topaz opinion about the retrograde and all.
Nah, man, the Fed vice chairman was wearing a red sweater, so obviously prices are gonna pump. Okay, but actually, as far as like maybe like order book stats go on Aptos and then depth and everything right now, I think I checked on Coinbase the other day and saw it might have been like 10K of depth on each side of the book, and I think that was at like almost 33% slippage. So if I'm not mistaken, that would mean that these are just numbers off the top of my head, but if you bought on Coinbase, I think a buy for like 10,000, you could move the price on there by like significant amount, even double-digit %. And so it makes me think that maybe there's like just not enough depth, or people who have maybe market maker agreements or whatever just aren't providing enough liquidity. You know, there's obviously liquidity on the central exchanges, but it doesn't seem like there's as much. And it could be that one exchange gets kind of out of whack because someone submits a huge market buy, for example, and then the bots need to take a while to like reallocate their liquidity on the platform. But then, like I was saying, you have all this positive feedback where other bots are saying, oh, the price on this one exchange went up this much. This means the price should now be higher, and they buy on the other exchanges. And if they're bots, maybe they're like, oh, this is really significant, I'm going to buy more. And so then they do the same thing, and they clear out the depth on like Binance or whatever. And you lead to like all this different volatility because they're all like looking at each other and pointing around. And I think that it does introduce this like really cool opportunity for us to potentially have even more depth for APT USDC, for example, even like on chain than on a centralized exchange. And in that point, I think we've reached this kind of like Rubicon where the actual price, where the legit price discovery is happening, is on chain. And then maybe it ends up, you know, consolidating all the volume into this one venue that is independent of Coinbase or Binance, and in one sense reduces the like positive feedback loops and maybe leads to more stability. I don't know. Commentary welcome.
That would be an amazing flipping if we can do price discovery on chain as opposed to on centralized exchanges. I think the markets would be way more transparent. People would be way less likely to do market manipulation or insider trading, given that addresses can be easily tracked. So I think that would be huge. Would definitely love to do it. Maybe it does happen on a alt L1 like Aptos first before it happens on something like Ethereum. I feel like Ethereum is pretty widespread.
Yeah, I think an altcoin probably is the premier opportunity for this to happen. I mean, I think Bitcoin and Ethereum volumes are by far the highest in crypto, and I don't know what they are on Binance, but I'm guessing there's more than $10,000 of USD on depth on either side of the book on there. And so even if you compare against, you know, all the different L2s or whatever, like you probably aren't going to beat that on chain. But yeah, Aptos does have an interesting opportunity, especially if everyone huddles around one, you know, like Econia, obviously, I'll show that. Then we could do it on chain. And I think if we can do that kind of that flippening scenario where the volume actually migrates on chain, I think that it starts to get rid of some of these sort of parasitic dynamics that you see traditionally, like HFT, for example, is a really big one. So there are different firms that essentially are like, you have a co-location right next to Binance's server. And because of that, you get the latency really down low. And then you can make trades faster. And so you're really just like arbing all the positions on the book over time by essentially getting real estate in this place next to Binance. And that's not necessarily like doing anything helpful as far as price discovery. Like, you're not predicting things based on the news. You're not incorporating information about ledger wallets. You're not actually incorporating like necessarily legitimate economic information into the price. But if you do it on chain, there's at least this, like, while Aptos is fast, it still introduces like the latency of the speed of light. And because of that, you are sort of prevented from taking into account these sort of parasitic things where it's like, oh, who submitted an order at what time in the last 20 nanoseconds or whatever. Okay, maybe not nanoseconds, but microseconds if you're in an exchange like Binance, as opposed to the NASDAQ. And so at that point, you actually are, like you said, you're getting more stability and more legitimate information is incorporated into the price discovery process. So I think that it could get rid of a lot of these sort of actors that are skimming things off the top that we see in traditional markets by bringing it on chain, almost by imposing a sort of latency requirement that could be beneficial.
I just want to say, Sadoshi, you might take a look at the listeners that just joined, and just take a look who joined us.
Great, yeah. So thank you, Neil, for welcome on stage, and I see Mo as well. If you'd like to come up, definitely happy to have you on. And yeah, definitely agree with you there, Alnoki, and the fact that potentially this blockchain could be a solution to high frequency trading. Like, it's definitely not fair that an exchange can just set up right next to the CME, or in this instance Binance, and get an unfair advantage just by having real estate. And yeah, Aptos said speed of light, I believe we were benchmarking 200 milliseconds, which it's close to what it would take for servers to think around the world. You can definitely do pretty fast trading. I would argue there is some value in HFT and making markets a bit more efficient, but I think like the unfair advantage is definitely not good. But yeah, you're welcome.
Hey guys, thanks for having us.
There is also someone with the name of Moshaik wanted to join. I mean, he's a listener. I don't know if he wanted to join, but he's listening to us.
Cool. Yeah, bring him up.
Hey everyone, appreciate y'all hosting the space and having me and Neil too. This is interesting to hear. Hey Alex.
Hello there. Thanks for joining.
Also amazing stuff, Pontem on the ledger announcement yesterday, or 2 days ago, I should say.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a huge milestone for the ecosystem. We were just speaking about that and how honestly it's the first step to enable more safety. We were also talking about the advantages of being able to do key recovery with Aptos and potentially moving into smart contract wallets, being able to do social recovery with multi-sigs. And this is a big step, I think, to enable more people to feel more comfortable using DeFi, for example, on Aptos.
Another advantage too, I'll add to that, is that you can do key rotation with a vanity address to have a secured vanity address that corresponds to your protocol. So for example, Econia uses Codebook for a lot of its sort of like fun examples on the docs. And we could actually, now that we can use key rotation on Aptos, we can launch under something that says Codebook and then rotate it. And then you're not scared that you have a hot wallet private key connected to that.
Yeah, what's exciting is that a lot of the primitives that are built into Aptos themselves are very forward thinking and getting us to like modern infrastructure for crypto. Kind of curious to hear as well from Mo, Neil, what y'all think some of the best use cases so far and how you'll see maybe DeFi and NFTs evolving on Aptos.
Neil, do you want to go first?
I was going to offer you to go first, but yeah, I mean, a few things that you guys mentioned are really interesting. Key rotation, looking at stuff like account abstraction or veiled coins, which I'm not sure if you guys have seen yet, but is a super interesting primitive that we're put out a PR for that'll allow for privacy on chain in a different way that has been done before. And I think taking what has existed on other networks previously, when you think about what started on Ethereum and then progressively improved on other more efficient chains like Solana, I think what Serum did with the central limit order book was a good first step in that direction. But folks like Pontem and Alex at Econia taking that one step further with what they're building is super interesting for DeFi. And I see James here. James is our resident in-house DeFi degen. Would love to hear some of his thoughts too if we can bring him up. But I guess, Mel, anything else from your end that you're thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think you named some interesting stuff. If you haven't looked at the PR for veiled tokens, I think that's a very interesting component to pay attention to. But I think it draws upon a much bigger theme, right? And I think I don't know if Pontem or Alex you were talking about this, but most protocols weren't necessarily built with scale in mind, and because of that, there have been many bubblegum and Band-Aid patches to try to support scale. And by doing that, and I'm not going to call anything out specifically, those patches often expose exactly what Alex mentioned, rent seekers that come in and say, okay, cool, we'll help you scale, we'll help solve some of these problems where we're going to take a cut of this. And this isn't nothing new to Web3 or DeFi. It's existed for quite some time. And when we were designing and thinking about Aptos and all the different use cases we wanted to support, we wanted to make sure those security was not compromised, and you didn't have to have these patches to solve for billions of people. And Econia is taking an unfair advantage of this. Pontem is building some really cool stuff, but all of that stays on chain, which is really important. And I think, Alex, you mentioned something really interesting, latency at the speed of light. I haven't heard that one, so you get full credit for that. But the more we can keep on chain, the more we can have more efficient markets. And so, DeFi has done an amazing job of showcasing what it could potentially do in terms of creating accessibility, and now you can finally do it without all the challenges and the layers in between. In the old or the previous generation of L1s or L2s, and we're looking at kind of a paradigm shift. And I'm very excited about all the stuff that Econia and Pontem are putting out in market. And so that's kind of my perspective. But James, I think you should definitely jump in here. I know you've been going deep on some of these things.
Yeah. So, there are certain use cases particular to DeFi that I feel like have really been just virtually impossible on chain. There were some fast Ethereum killers out there, but the lack of stability was really a death sin for a lot, or death knell for a lot of more high frequency trading strategies. You look at some of the successes in Q4 were like GMX as an example on Arbitrum. So that was one of the first really powerful derivatives markets outside of DYDX. I think that's a really untapped area that Aptos is very uniquely suited to serve. So, for instance, this morning, about an hour ago, I was talking to a project that's building on Aptos that's looking at some very specific high frequency trading strategies that haven't been done in DeFi before. They've really just been the purview of centralized exchanges. So I think they're, specific to DeFi, there are some new things that are going to be enabled that really haven't been done before. But a lot of those other traditional use cases in crypto that we've all talked about and are excited about that have been restricted due to smart contracting languages, for various reasons. So I think you're going to see a lot of new use cases and various things that we probably haven't even thought of are enabled either because of the stability and speed of Aptos, but also Move as a programming language. It's just much more extensible.
Yeah, I agree 100% there. I think the next killer app is going to be essentially breaching the same performance thresholds that centralized apps have. I think what we learned from this cycle, I think, is just that unfortunately DeFi can't be trusted unless it's using DeFi or leaning heavily on it. But the performance really isn't there, and as you mentioned, and we won't say which one. I think reliability on something the more performing ones has also been an issue. So that's definitely going to hinder adoption for institutional players as well as I think individuals. I can imagine your transaction getting stuck must feel as bad as not knowing whether you're going to get out of that centralized exchange. So I'm really excited for Aptos, and I think we'll probably see a lot of the same adoption of primitives that are really popular on centralized exchanges. Perpetuals is definitely one, especially in this type of market. And I think Tsunami is building this on Aptos as well. So really excited for them to launch and see that come to life as well on Aptos at the same performance level that we would be expecting.
On that topic of the technical unlocks of Aptos and what this enables in DeFi that hasn't been done before, one of the crucial parts of this is high performance parallelism. And so what Aptos brings in this new way is optimistic concurrency. And so it essentially allows you to execute transactions that don't collide with each other in parallel without having to check ahead of time if they necessarily will. And this makes it easier on developers because they don't have to declare the different regions of global state they can touch. In Econia, the practical result of this is that you can have two markets running in parallel without having any overlapping memory. We don't use any kind of like global counters or anything. So there's no collisions between operations. And this means you could do price discovery for like APT USD, or you could even run perpetual futures on like soy beans denominated in euros or something, right? You can do anything on chain. You just need a symbol and you need size and price. And so Econia allows you to do this with spot trading with Aptos framework coins, also with derivatives. And like I was mentioning earlier with some of the latency things and bringing it on chain, I know that Aptos sees sub-second finality, I believe, at any node. And I've heard that I think validators might even get down under 500 milliseconds. And in my opinion, this is kind of like a sweet spot because it allows information in a sense to like propagate around the world, things like weather events, things like large purchases from institutions or announcements about whether some new product will be released. You can incorporate that into your kind of decision making at your trading algorithm, and then you can publish it on chain. and the transaction can clear all at once. And this is an unlock that we got with Econia with our atomic matching engine. So you can think about like information propagating around the world. Someone incorporates that into their model and they make a trade on chain and the price discovery happens there. And it is based solely on new information about the world that we actually want to incorporate into our economic models about things. And because of the key unlocks on Aptos, you don't have to wait, like you said, Sadoji, for something to clear or wait in a queue because of the optimistic concurrency, we can clear transactions during the order can clear in the transaction during which it was placed. And so you have this almost like ideal amount of time that puts a kind of damper on parasitic tactics, but encourages the legitimate economic information to be incorporated all at the same time. And you don't get an advantage necessarily by having anything more than just running your own like validator node and participating in the price discovery at the kind of bleeding edge of it.
Yeah, we benchmark 200 milliseconds, and a good centralized exchange might have like 40, 50, 60 milliseconds. But to be honest, if everyone's on the same, sub-second latency, it's better for everyone. No one gets like an unfair advantage. And I think that's probably also a big hindrance to adoption for DeFi, the fact that centralized exchanges can move faster. So there's definitely toxic order flow there. So yeah, if we can make a campaign to move price discovery or most of the trading to happen on chain, I think that's definitely going to be a fair future for everyone. That's a very interesting thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's a market maker that I've known for a few years. Mo and I were in London for Token 2049, and I sat down with the CEO and I said, what are your thoughts about DeFi? Like, is this a lucrative area for market makers? And his response was pretty telling. He said, we have no advantage here. Typically the protocols, like the high frequency trading strategies, are simply impossible to perform on chain. So while we're happy to support certain DeFi protocols, a lot of the advantages that a market maker does and how they actually turn a profit haven't been possible in the past. So when you talk about getting down to 200 millisecond latency, like sure, on a centralized exchange, with algorithmic trading, maybe 40, 50, 100 milliseconds is ideal. But man, there hasn't been an opportunity to get down to 200 milliseconds. So I think you're going to see additionally a lot of more institutional players that previously treated this as, or might have used regulatory as an excuse, really are going to be able to find new trading strategies that just haven't been possible before.
I think also that the mempool approach and having all the trading data be on chain makes it even easier to implement these strategies, because you aren't segmented behind like a wall to a black box to see what orders are going into a centralized exchange, and also to know that maybe they aren't necessarily listing everything in a queue, or you're not seeing everything on a book, and so that you can get these kind of, like you said, toxic flow strategies, because with an on-chain strategy, right, it's all there and everyone knows exactly how the matching engine works. These are also things that we don't necessarily know from centralized exchanges. So you might get like an API spec from the NASDAQ, or you might get an API spec from Binance, but you don't necessarily know how that code is executing because it's not open source, because it's proprietary. But in our case with DeFi, we are strongly incentivized to make it open source because it helps us build us more robust and trusted protocols that can be secured for the long term with things like audits and bug bounties and that sort of thing. And so I think that it provides even more visibility, and when those latencies reach comparable standards, that DeFi actually has a lot of advantages, right, over the centralized exchanges. And really it is just the kind of delay that's getting in the way.
Yeah, definitely, hopefully see this being in the future where more, especially for crypto native applications, starts to move on chain, and slowly we'll start to eat the rest of the centralized finance world. I think real world assets will probably see stablecoins as a first wave, and more of that essentially settling and taking use of these advantages. I think a lot of people don't really understand these nuances of why DeFi can be way better than CeFi. Want to ask the Aptos team a question, diving deeper into the veiled coins. If it's an AIP that's coming out, or really curious about that, because if the name leads on, privacy is definitely another requirement that a lot of institutions are asking for. If you're a proprietary trading firm, you don't really want to give away your strategy. So yeah, kind of curious to hear more about that.
Neil, do you want to take that? I'm not sure
I
where we
also
are in the
have some
roadmap there.
exposure to it. I also have some exposure to it through conversations and presentations with Aline, and can comment if you guys would like.
Yeah, Alex, I'd love to hear your perspective on it, actually.
Okay, so yeah, Aline, one of the cryptographers at Aptos, he presented on some of the veiled coin implementations, I think a couple months ago, maybe during a Move Mondays presentation, where he and David were talking about new sort of upcoming things in the pipeline. And the veiled coin relies on this cryptographic notion of Peterson commitments, which essentially allows you to verify that something has happened without actually kind of saying like what happened. Kind of like a zero knowledge proof, in that you can transfer things between people, but on chain, no one knows how much someone has. And so with the veiled coin, you can essentially deposit into, I think he might have called it an envelope. So you can see on the transaction how much someone puts into this kind of like black box, the envelope. But once it's in there, you no longer know how much is transacting between counterparties. So essentially, like Alice deposits 300 into her kind of veiled coin envelope. Bob deposits 800 into her veiled coin envelope. And then they can transact among each other with these Peterson commitments. And of the original, net amount, no one knows what is split between the two. And so if you can kind of envision a world where everyone sort of moves into the veiled coin world, and sure, what someone deposited at the beginning, or maybe what they want to like cash out back into Aptos coin or USDC at the end, but you don't know how much anyone has at any one time. And so it is a great way to do privacy. And you can maybe envision a dynamic later down the road where the people who are making these original deposits into the envelope are like really big players. And so the people like Alice and Bob are actually just getting their veiled coin straight from that bigger player. And so you never know how much they even got in the first place. Obviously, it introduces a kind of trusted central counterparty, kind of like Circle, but we have, again, trusted central counterparties like Circle who can facilitate these transactions. I think it's an interesting use case for tracking assets at an individual level. It would be somewhat of a technical challenge to incorporate it into DeFi, because you kind of need to know how much someone is trading. But obviously, there are different strategies that we can use to try and facilitate transfers in this more private way. And I think it's a really big right step forward, because it allows people to have kind of like configurable privacy at different levels depending on the use case.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's definitely a huge step forward. I can see definitely some of the challenges of integrating to DeFi. If you need, you need to make a trade. You need to know how much the other person is making. But yeah, these are definitely some of the challenges that I think will come as we see more and more conservative institutions start to adopt DeFi. A lot of these requirements we'll see definitely on security and having the availability of custody solutions, or at least being able to outsource that to someone that can help them manage it is a big one. And Ledger, multi-sig, in the future, maybe smart contract wallets. I think it's going to be a huge step in getting those first in here. Kind of curious to hear maybe also how the Aptos team sees the NFT and gaming space developing. I think we've talked a lot about DeFi, and I think in the audience too, a lot of people are interested in NFTs, and I think high throughput, low transaction fees, I think is going to be huge for gaming, as we've seen also been adopted. So yeah, kind of curious to hear how you all see it.
I think one of the premier use cases for NFTs is ticketing. I know a lot of people who have some issues with Ticketmaster, at least recently, and I think that it's actually a pretty premier use case. We'll see if maybe even people start to fractionalize these, and then you can trade on tickets and maybe do some kind of more price discovery on chain. That's, I think, an interesting use case I'd like to put out there, but obviously not the most paramount one. We'll see what other commentary people might have.
We have actually Greg from Aptos joining, so you want to kick me and put him? Maybe he can also add his point.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The question was around just what's going on in gaming. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. What do you see today? I know Metapixel is a big one, and what do you see in the future? And some of the advantages that we've talked about DeFi, I think, are also very transferable for gaming and NFTs.
I love it when you ask the question and then answer it yourself. That's, I mean, I think you summed it up actually quite well, right? Like all the same attributes that you guys have been talking about on this space are completely applicable to gaming, right? In fact, there's just a different use case for those assets because you're actually using them, within a metaverse or immersive environment. And so, you want to make sure that that environment does not get disrupted, that experience does not get disrupted. And so, when we were speaking with a bunch of gaming companies out there, they felt uncomfortable with Web3 based on the lack of all those attributes. And so, after diving deeper into Aptos, getting comfortable with the technology and how, let's say 10 million gamers that might be playing at the same time or attending a Fortnite concert at the same time could transact with each other. And so, we started to get folks more comfortable. And Pixel was actually one of the first that was thinking about traversing into Web3 in a very big way. And through our deep discussions with them, they got comfortable with what we had built relative to everything else that was in the market. And I'll let them share their story and how they got to their decision at some point, and maybe we should consider hosting a space with them. But ultimately, now you can have a digital experience where you can be connected with people across the globe, and use NFTs that you had in a more dynamic and in a more dynamic way. And so, we're really, really excited about the gaming space. And in fact, it's a space that I'm personally happy to see just because, I'm a gamer myself. So in, in 23, I think we're going to see a lot more games really pick Web3 up now that they understand the potential can actually come to fruition. And, I think we're going to be demonstrating that, or actually, and Metapixel is going to be demonstrating that and showcasing the strength of the network. I don't know if Neil or Greg, you have anything to add.
I'm always excited about gaming. I actually, it's funny, you guys called me up. I completely missed what you guys were talking about. I'm trying to decide from what Mo was talking about that actually what you're doing. Gaming super excites me just in general. And Mo, we can hear your dog squeaky toy.
Sorry about that. I'm gonna go on mute.
Yeah.
Well,
the question was just generally around how you see NFTs and gaming developing on Aptos. In my own personal experience, people would think, oh, it's just a game. Why would it matter if my, hat or Halloween mask is, valuable? Well, when you put in hundreds of hours, if not thousands of hours into getting that party hat, and then all of a sudden someone hacks and makes, infinite mint party hats, then yes, you do care that party hat is, there's only one of them, or one of 400, 500. So this is my experience personally playing RuneScape as a kid. So definitely see the value in it and excited to get it back.
I always wanted one of those party hats. I never got one. Yeah, my experience playing RuneScape as a kid too. Like, it's funny because you just saw people make these scammy secondary markets where people are like, "Hey, buy my, party hat and give me give me like $1,000 or something," and then you could. I see people all the time do these try to do these off out of game transactions, and they're like, "Oh, I'll just hand it to you," but really what they do is just take your money and run. And by having something like on chain that says you had all this time and effort put into it, and now you can actually make a transaction very securely and easily instead of having this weird place where someone can just scam you. And additionally, pretty much most RPGs and things have in-game markets. Like I was playing New World last year while I wasn't well, not last year, 2 years ago, before I started working at Aptos, and didn't have as much time to play an RPG. What I found is all these games, they have in-game markets. They have keeping track of the prices. You can actually be able to trade based on that, and it's interesting that they have their own in-game economics. When if that could be in-game, you can actually have it out of the game too when you want to trade it for assets that you can say, I spent hundreds of hours playing this game. Let me go and make it so I can go get assets in a different game. So I actually, instead of losing the progress that I spent hundreds of hours, I can use it for a different platform, which would be great.
On that note of pricing out and trading in-game assets, I think Pontem, and also I remember Nick from Topaz, who was on earlier, talking about this, that there's a new kind of emerging idea of making AMMs for trading NFTs that have similar floor prices. So you essentially, right, you assume that they're fungible at least within some kind of class, and then you can deposit them into an AMM pool. Also, there's an opportunity to do it on an order book with fractionalization, or if you assume fungibility, you could represent them in a tokenized way. Maybe Pontem can comment a little more on that, on how it would look, in game, and how that could maybe allow you to move between games, like Greg was talking about.
Yeah, definitely. It's a way, and you explained it very well. It's a way to use the same AMM technology for what would be relatively semi-fungible assets. So something like movie tickets would be a great example. All assets that people assume to be the same floor price, I think, is also a good example. And then what the experience looks like is essentially a buy now button at that floor price, which is being priced in the same way that you would price two assets on a constant function market maker. So yeah, I think that's going to be huge to enable more liquidity. No longer does it need to be an eBay auction for people to purchase NFTs. And yeah, this integrated as well into games, I think would be super interesting as well, as you would imagine. Maybe like swords or food inside a game having higher velocity of movement than something like an art NFT. So yeah, really excited about this being incorporated for games to come.
I think fractional ownership is a really interesting idea that I'm excited to see MMOs explore in the future. I used to be a huge EVE Online player, and I don't know if anyone is familiar with that, but I would say it's probably the most complex in-game economy in Web2 gaming today. And a lot of the really in-game structures require the pooling of dozens, if not hundreds of people, really pulling their money together to purchase like a ship station in space. You can see that extracted out to the early attempts at purchasing land through Decentraland. Well, those were relatively empty metaverses. It's an interesting idea to think of a AAA, MMO where you could actually purchase land, or you could purchase a castle with your guild, and it is now impervious to all the scams and things where people are capable of, stealing that asset from the guild and running with it. So I don't know. It's a lot of interesting new economic opportunities for Web 2.
The fractionalization definitely helps with that process, and I would add too, let's almost like these holding companies emerge in the metaverse for different assets, because you can trade, publicly speculate on the price of a stadium or a castle or whatever inside your game, and you can let individuals get into that too, kind of like a publicly owned company. It's like a publicly owned piece of property, and people will begin to speculate on the personal level, like, well, I think that this castle is underpriced, but I can't buy the whole castle, so I'll just buy a share of it, or a perpetual futures contract, and you can even short it and respond to things like new drops of other things, or maybe someone decides to apply a new skin and you think the price changes. And I think it allows for more efficient in-game pricing of assets that you can do right with AMMs, I think, on the lower liquidity items, but on higher visibility things, I think that the perpetuals futures pricing on NFTs ends up being like a great way to do it on an order book for really efficient, high visibility items. And maybe Nick from Topaz can comment on these two kinds of dynamics as well.
I have a question actually while Nick is connecting, maybe for all of you. And as I'm representing normies in terms of like technology and all, I just kind of agree with the point that James made about Ava and like other games like metaverses, that they have huge markets like Roblox and Fortnite, all this kind of games, Web2 games. They have huge market, many like transactions like per day. Actually, wrote a small article about that like metaverse in terms of like Decentraland, they have like around 100 users per day versus Roblox have millions users per day, and they have all this microtransaction. Do you guys see the point how blockchain in future can kind of infiltrate that market, or they'll be separate? And yeah.
Yeah, kind of curious to hear Topaz's opinion. And in my view, I think the games fundamentally themselves also have to be open for this to really work out. And a good example of what Greg was saying earlier was essentially that these, side markets would pop up because the the game itself didn't allow like peer-to-peer, transfer or sale of stuff like this. So it'll be interesting. Similarly for NFTs, I think one of the biggest advantages is that you can take one NFT and then embed it into another game. You can just move it like you would any other asset. However, if the game itself is centralized, let's say like a Grand Theft Auto, and they don't want to, create a skin for your monkey or your ape, then that's up to them. But if the game was somehow more open, permissionless, and people could create, skins that are equivalent to NFTs, I think that would probably be a better indicator of adoption.
I think Roblox is a really awesome example. Like, one thing I don't think people understand about Roblox is they've been building it for like 12 years. It's not, I think in basically the past couple of years, it sort of blew up and like became like a household name, but it's been around for basically forever. But the reason it's so powerful and like attracts so many people is like anyone can build a game, anyone can get it on the App Store, anyone can send it to their friends. It has like a really robust engine. It has all the tooling necessary, and yeah. But every game is created by just users. Users create a game, and I think it's a really good model for like Web3. And there's a lot of things about Roblox that would be better if it was built on, say, Aptos. So I'm really excited to see what people are going to build. I mean, also a lot of problems people have maybe with crypto exist in Roblox too, but it's like more centralized. Like you just have like 8-year-olds gambling on loot boxes.
Yeah,
It's a giant market, you know. These people might be joining Aptos in future, and so this 8-year-olds will become 18 years old soon.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the big story of Roblox is there's just like some 14-year-old kid who made a game, and then it was making like $1 million a month. And then Roblox is taking what, like 30%, 50% of the proceeds. But in like a Web3 world, like the creator would probably have a much bigger piece of that. And then that can be reinvested in the ecosystem and then other builders. So I don't know, it's really exciting. And I think it's user-generated content. It's like very powerful and probably is going to be like a key driver of all the cool stuff. I don't think like necessarily the future of Web3 gaming is going to be like, Call of Duty, but NFT skins. It'll probably be something that we don't even know about. And it just requires like people building cool stuff and experimenting, and then people trying it out, and like what's going to capture like the imagination of like the next billion users.
Earlier I had mentioned, kind of North Star ideas within Web3 that have previously largely been unfeasible. And I think you just hit on one, which is royalties. The ability for creators to continue to own their content. I actually have an 8-year-old daughter who plays Roblox, so that's near and dear to my heart. But it's really, you look at, other Web2 platforms, they have the ability to platform someone, and then you're really out of luck. If you get kicked off of YouTube or Twitter in the past, that could be a potential large revenue stream. Actually being able to control your content across platforms, I think is something that's going to be coming in the future. And then, you'll see these Web2 platforms actually go out and try to attract these users because of the amount of their content and paying royalties to them for that access.
Yeah, I think we'll likely see a lot of the same things that were adopted in Web 2 happening first iteratively on Web 3, but then people realize there's all these other benefits, like, hey, maybe I have some censorship resistance from everything that I've created getting locked away or not being able to monetize it, and then that'll probably cost people to stay, hopefully.
Yeah, how dare you demonetize my Naruto game?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's kind of interesting, but having this as a way for people, the creator economy is something that's super interesting, and I think has definitely been around for a while, but now we're just globalizing it even more. Like you don't need access to even like a bank account really to get started, which is I think pretty powerful because I can imagine like anybody in the world really can watch YouTube videos, get themselves up to speed on how to use something like Unreal or one of these platforms, even Roblox as a platform, and just being able to make a living, which is honestly pretty powerful. Even like YouTube today might not be as easy to.
And I think it gives people the opportunity to enter the Web3 economy, like you said, without having these on-ramps. And I think that we saw this in a like a kind of earlier primitive way with Axie Infinity, like the play to earn narrative. There were people who were playing and they got the funds in their wallets and they didn't have to go through a bank, and that let them get into crypto in a big way in the beginning. And I think too, like you said, you can have, younger players performing tasks in game, right, and doing essentially like labor or like a side hustle that lets them get involved in the economy, and then they can start to learn about all the different ways that you can, right, like make a living, like depending on where you live in the world, right, with the Web3 economy. And you don't have to go through the centralized fiat on ramps and off ramps that are only like often available to a small percentage of the world, at least at the moment.
That's a very interesting moral question, whether kids playing video games for work should be like child labor.
Man, I was just about to say that.
Well, one thing that's interesting, I think we forget as we become adults is, I remember when I was like 13, or I wanted to like play Magic cards online, but I didn't have a credit card, and like my parents were like, "No, you can't spend $7 online to like buy some cards or whatever." But I would have like, I don't know, filled out some forms. I would have played a game to like just to earn like $5, because the barrier to entry isn't the amount necessarily. Like it's the access. Like you can't even sign up for a credit card, or like have a bank account, or a lot of basic things to like even like sort of interact with like the digital world at all. And crypto sort of opens that up.
But at the moment, actually, I think the main thing that we should overcome, like in Web3 and all, I think KuCoin was the last big exchange that did not require two-factor authentication for withdrawals. And I don't see any of those big players removing that in the nearest time. I mean, for Pontem and for other wallets, you don't need two-factor authentication, but you basically need money from somewhere. Like from the MoonPay, I think that was the closest one that we got so far in terms of like helping to onboard more users to Web3, but still you get the card. So that's interesting point. Like, I think the only way, actually, I used to have small blog like how to make money Web3, and like even from for teens, basically to have airdrops. So airdrop could be the easiest money that you can get. I mean, Aptos had it, and like other blockchains. And basically, you can participate in economy without like investing anything and not using credit card. I think that's the only way that I know so far. Or maybe some basically blockchain gives you money in terms of like you're participating in some content, you got what I mean, like games or whatever. And yeah, I think that's the closest one we got so far, but I don't see, like, in my personal perspective, how we can overcome this in the future.
Yeah, I think Econia was talking about that as well. Like the so from the regulatory perspective, I think most of these exchanges are going away from being able to let you put things in and out without identifying yourself. But when it comes to something like the play to earn games, you might not have to. And I think that's sort of where like Axie Infinity came into play with getting money to people who don't have necessarily have it, or some of the other like airdrop kind of related things. And it's an interesting problem because, right, these like exchanges and things generally are regulated in whatever places that they are. So it comes into like them trying not to get shut down and some other things that are related with it. And it's hard because, even you're talking about a kid who's like, 8 years old, wants to buy a RuneScape membership or something, but there are people elsewhere in the world who don't necessarily have the credit card, don't necessarily have a bank account or whatever to build into the system. And it's important to keep in mind the people who don't have that infrastructure ready for them, but they should be hopefully getting into the Web3 space.
Yeah, I agree 100%. The message here should be financial access and not child labor. So I think it's interesting though, because this does, I mean, it opens up a maybe moral and actual policy question of like how this stuff should be regulated. Like it's essentially a way to transmit money over the internet, and we have in place some of these checks and balances like KYCML at on and off ramps to make sure that we're not financing terrorists, for example, or there isn't money laundering going on. But how do you add this to crypto? And it may be my own personal opinion, but I do think it needs to be a layer on top. And some of these financial institutions that are moving billions of dollars a day, like exchanges, should probably have these systems in place. But potentially a game that's doing microtransactions or or just essentially not moving as much value potentially would be important. But maybe there is some partnership of delegating access or testing for people that have gone through KYCML with exchanges, so that there's not a huge burden on a game or some other application that might also need to do this. But we're definitely locking a lot of people out because not a lot of people have access to a form of ID that's going to give them access to a financial institution. So it's definitely an interesting conundrum.
I think what you said about having it be a layer on top is probably the most appropriate and maybe the only workable way. What you were talking about reminds me of, I think it was Gavin Wood from Polkadot, who classified blockchain technology at the base level, like the infrastructure layer, almost as what he called illegal. Not like it's legal or it's not illegal, but it doesn't apply, like in the same way that a tornado can't be illegal or the sun can't be illegal, like it's just a force of nature. And forcing someone to stay in a tornado and die could be like, is like an illegal and reprehensible thing, but the tornado itself is like, you can't really control that. And that in the sense that we've created blockchains that are a kind of force of nature, that maybe they are really just like the infrastructure level play, in the same way that we've, I think, come to view like the TCP/IP protocol, right? We're not censoring or we're not like holding Comcast accountable for delivering like bits and bytes to people if those bits and bytes hold malicious content or are somehow involved in some kind of reprehensible process, but rather it is often a layer on top, like it is the front end server provider, or it is the service that takes their credit card information and lets them interact with the UX, right? That's where it resides, but there might not even be a way to regulate it at the blockchain level, because we have to do maybe a permission blockchain where we can roll back transactions or something like that. But then it defeats the purpose of a lot of these public things. So there's kind of a trade-off in the way that we might even be able to gate access. And it makes me think that perhaps the real way to go about it is, like you said, the layer above. And I think this is the way a lot of regulatory scrutiny is going right now, is that it is who's operating on top of it, the centralized exchange, or for like dApps, or for example, it's the front end protocol that normally that's the biggest kind of legal risk for them, is where do we serve this content from, and who is serving it under what legal entity, for example, because that's really where you can kind of prevent people from getting in. I mean, sure, if someone knows how to use the command line and they're very savvy, they might be able to interact with whatever, but most people really, if you can regulate things at the kind of front end level or at the higher level, that is the right place to kind of to maybe regulate these things.
Yeah, this is super interesting. I think we'll probably see regulation happening at the app level. I think Eric Voorhees made a really good point on comparing crypto and crypto transactions to like an email protocol, whereas we're not forcing people to put KYCML on Gmail or any individual front end. And he did raise this to SBF, who didn't really have a good response to it. But I mean, it's interesting because I mean, you could block the front end, but if you have access to the CLI or just any other front end that can pop up, that's not really going to stop it. And in my opinion, being this illegal or censorship resistant to any individual government, I think is important. And it's good and bad because it's a double-edged sword that allows for freedom of information to move around from repressive governments or authoritarian regimes, but it also fosters criminals that can move around and very easily without any friction. So it's good and bad, but I do think that it's more important that this technology stays free and open. Like we are already seeing, for example, large countries like China start to ban crypto and Bitcoin, but can they actually really? That's a good question, and some examples to look at is, for example, validators not including OFAC address transactions from OFAC sanctioned addresses like Tornado Cash. However, other validators do, which means it doesn't get entirely censored from Ethereum. It only takes longer if you're going through this because not all validators are using it. But is that good? Is that bad? Like if all validators switch to not including transactions, then we are effectively censoring certain transactions. I think the general trend after one of the latest upgrades, I think, to the merge, this wasn't an issue as much anymore. But that's like an interesting question, and I think Bitcoin is also potentially also harder to censor, given that you need these large ASIC devices or for proof of work. But it's definitely happening, and I think it's better for it to be censorship. That's my own personal view.
Satoshi, let me know if that's a bit off topic, but since we talk about mass adoption, I actually talked to my friend a few weeks ago, and he is from Syria. Well, we actually met in another country, but he told me like 90% of the population that has banks, they already use crypto. And there are some other countries, for example, and I was wondering if there is someone, I mean, from Syria in the chat or someone, because this is what I really want to know, because these countries, in my opinion, are pushing crypto. I mean, while we discuss this, they're already, I mean, obviously, most of us, we use a blockchain on every day, but in their countries, it's like a necessity that they don't have access to fiat because obviously what happened to their currency and so on. So this is like another radical example, and I think that's something that we can be like inspired from.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is also a difficult topic to talk about because obviously nobody wants to advocate or is advocating here for not adhering to sanctions, but especially even for I believe we had someone from Myanmar come in and say that it was like, yeah, crypto was definitely their an easy way to still have access to the financial system. So unfortunately, sanctions sometimes paint a broad brush where we're sanctioning all individuals from a country, and that who's to say that someone protesting in Iran, for example, against an authoritarian government needs to be sanctioned, and it could be quite sad to have such a broad brush for them. But yeah, it's interesting, and potentially crypto as a censorship resistant way, like for example, and you have to think about it more so from the perspective of the country themselves. Like the country like Syria or like Iran might be blocking crypto themselves and trying to, but they really can't, right? Because people have VPNs, people can connect the nodes through CLI, even if they're blocking at the front end level. So yeah, I think that's generally potentially important for the ability to have this be an open tech for everyone. Yeah, these are philosophical and I guess legal questions that you probably are not expert enough to answer, honestly, but we'll see. Right now it's a little bit of the Wild West, and hopefully regulation doesn't hit so hard that it sets back actual innovation of enabling this tech.
Yeah, is it too late in the Twitter space to say that none of this is legal or financial advice?
Yeah, exactly. Disclaimer. I know we have Chad also on the space, so Chad, would love to hear more from you. Definitely would love to have you on as well. So maybe give an intro to the folks on. maybe left on. I mean, we are coming up on 2 hours, so happy to wrap it up as well. Alnoki from Econia, Alexi, would definitely love to have you on again, and yeah, just hang out here. We had a great space. Glad to see some of the Aptos folks pop in. As you can see, they really are accessible. Mo, Neil, James, Greg, all of them are really accessible, and I think that's also an important part of why I think Aptos will do well compared to some of the other ecosystems, and in terms of their team being really accessible and being in to help us build. So yeah, really excited to have everyone on, and thank you everyone for listening.
Just some closing remarks from my side, and then everyone can add if they want. I was just about to say about the accessibility. Actually, I'm a blockchain manager at Everstake. I never introduced myself. I think Everstake is one of the largest validators with over 500,000 delegators. So I'm blockchain manager for several blockchains, but I have never seen that in space, even like Pontem, it's like giant dApp and so on. Like CEOs jump in, the official account jump in, so it's a great sign. And yeah, I would love to participate in other MEAs, and actually DM'd you if you want to have like another MEA that we will host like on my space or on Everstake space. Just let me know.
Yeah, this was a pretty hefty Twitter space. Thank you to all of the OGs who started with my little ledger diatribe and stayed with us through everything we ended up talking about. While we're here at the end and we're talking about our projects, yeah, I'm core developer at Econia. Everything we have is open source, has been open source since inception. Go look at our code, go read our docs at econia.dev. We're going through final audits right now. We're just getting our reports back from 3 independent auditors. That's 3. And yeah, we're glad to be building the future of DeFi with y'all folks. Thanks again for having us, Pontem.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and hope to have more of these. Honestly, these are fun. And yeah, a bit of a rough start, but we got through too.